My stepdaughter looked me right in the eye and said the greatest gift I could provide for her wedding was my absence. She told me I was not her real dad, I was just John. My wife of 20 years sat right next to her, sipping her wine, completely silent. So I did exactly what they asked. I disappeared. But not before selling the coastal villa from right under them and canceling every single wedding expense I had paid for. What I left on the empty kitchen counter shocked them to their core. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Let me explain how a 68-year-old man dismantled an entire life in 48 hours. The late morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my coastal villa in Monterey. The Pacific Ocean churned violently outside, a stark contrast to the immaculate climate-controlled silence of the foyer. I stood near the arched doorway holding a freshly printed receipt. It was a cleared invoice for $25,000. That piece of paper represented the final payment for thousands of imported white orchids currently being arranged for my stepdaughter Morgan's wedding reception. I had liquidated a significant portion of my private retirement portfolio to ensure those flowers arrived on time from Holland. I smoothed the crease in the paper, listening to the sharp, aggressive tapping echoing from the adjacent dining room. Morgan was pacing across the imported mahogany floors. She clutched a silver clipboard to her chest, barking seating arrangements into her smartphone. She had the wedding planner on speakerphone. The planner sounded exhausted, desperately trying to keep up with Morgan's endless demands regarding the VIP guest list and the exact placement of the champagne fountain. I walked into the dining room, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished wood. I waited patiently for a pause in the conversation. I had raised Morgan since she was 5 years old. I paid for her braces, funded her out-of-state college tuition, and bought the luxury sedan sitting in the driveway. I considered her my own blood. I believed the feeling was mutual. Morgan finished berating the planner about the thread count of the table linens. She tossed the phone onto the table without hanging up. I took a step forward, offering a warm smile. I placed the floral invoice near her clipboard, mentioning that the orchids were fully paid for and scheduled for delivery by Friday morning. Morgan barely glanced at the receipt. She offered a curt nod, her eyes already scanning her guest list. I cleared my throat, shifting my weight. I asked her what time I should arrive at the venue tomorrow for the father-daughter dance rehearsal. I had spent the last 3 weeks secretly practicing a waltz in the garage, wanting to make sure I did not step on her expensive designer gown. The aggressive tapping of her pen stopped instantly. The silence in the dining room became absolute. Even the wedding planner on the open phone line stopped typing on her keyboard. Morgan slowly raised her head. She looked at me not with the affection of a daughter, but with the cold, calculating gaze of an auditor examining a discrepancy. She let out a short, hollow laugh that lacked any trace of humor. She crossed her arms over her chest, stepping away from the invoice I had just handed her. She looked me right in the eye and stated with absolute clarity that there would be no father-daughter dance. I froze, confused, asking if she had decided to change the reception schedule. She shook her head, her expression hardening into a mask of pure disdain. She told me there was no schedule change because I was not going to be at the wedding. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I asked her to repeat herself, certain my 68-year-old ears had misunderstood the cruelty in her voice. Morgan stepped closer, ensuring every syllable landed with maximum impact. She told me the greatest gift I could provide for her special day was my total absence. She explained that her biological father, a man who had abandoned her 2 decades ago and never contributed a single dime to her upbringing, had suddenly re-entered her life last month. He was going to walk her down the aisle. He was going to have the dance. She explicitly declared that I was not her real dad. I was just John, a convenient roommate, a walking checkbook. She told me I would only embarrass her in front of her fiancé Justin's elite corporate family. The air vanished from my lungs. The rejection was a physical blow, a sudden violent strike to the center of my chest. I turned my head desperately, seeking a lifeline. My wife Barbara sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. We had been married for 20 years. I had pulled her out of crippling debt, provided her with a life of absolute luxury, and loved her daughter as my own. Barbara held a crystal glass of chilled Chardonnay. She looked out the panoramic window toward the crashing waves. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She offered absolute silence. She did not defend me. She did not correct her daughter. Her silence was a profound, deafening endorsement of my degradation. In that fraction of a second, the illusion of my family shattered completely. The veil was ripped away, exposing the raw, ugly truth of my existence in this house. I was merely a resource, a logistical solution to their financial desires. I calculated the exact numbers in my head. I had already liquidated $85,000 over the last 4 months to fund this single weekend. The $30,000 catering deposit, the custom designer dress, the imported orchids, the luxury transportation fleet. I had swallowed heavy capital gains taxes to make her dream come true. My financial sacrifice had bought me absolutely no respect, no loyalty, and no love. I looked back at Morgan. She was glaring at me, waiting for an argument, waiting for me to yell or throw a tantrum so she could play the victim. She wanted a scene to justify her cruelty. I refused to give her the satisfaction. The sorrow in my chest rapidly crystallized into a freezing, untouchable rage. I was a retired director of corporate logistics. My entire career was built on identifying structural weaknesses, dismantling inefficient supply chains, and ruthlessly cutting losses. My family had just proven they were a catastrophic deficit. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I simply nodded my head, acknowledging the new reality. I reached out and turned the floral invoice face down on the polished wood. I turned on my heel and walked away. I left the dining room, navigating the long hallway toward the back of the villa. I could hear Morgan pick up her phone, immediately resuming her demands to the wedding planner, as if discarding me was as trivial as choosing a napkin color. I entered my private study. I closed the heavy oak door. I turned the brass deadbolt. The metallic click echoed through the quiet room, signaling the definitive end of my endurance. The time for unconditional love had officially expired. The time for the silent adjustment had begun. I walked to my heavy mahogany desk, the only piece of furniture in the house I had picked out myself. I booted up my encrypted workstation. The dual monitors hummed to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the darkened study. The first stage of my counter-strike required absolute precision. I had granted Barbara and Morgan unchecked access to my secondary accounts for years, trusting them implicitly. That trust was now a glaring security breach. I opened the master banking portal. I stared at the blinking cursor, my logistics training taking complete control of my nervous system. They wanted me to disappear from the wedding. They wanted to pretend I did not exist. I was going to grant their wish with devastating accuracy. I was going to ensure that by the time the church bells rang, the entire financial foundation of their perfect day would be reduced to ash. The heavy oak door of my private study clicked shut, sealing out the ambient noise of the coastal villa. I turned the brass deadbolt. The metallic thud was the sound of a 20-year illusion finally fracturing. I walked across the Persian rug, a rare piece I had purchased during a logistics summit in Istanbul a decade ago, back when Diane actually pretended to care about my career. Now this room was my only genuine sanctuary, in a house that felt entirely foreign. I sat behind my mahogany desk, the surface intentionally clear of any personal family photographs. I booted up my encrypted workstation. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my hands. These were the hands that had built a nationwide supply chain network from nothing. Hands that were now supposedly too embarrassing to hold a bride during a traditional dance. My pulse remained unnervingly steady. Emotional detachment is a survival mechanism I perfected during hostile corporate takeovers in the late 90s. Family was no longer a factor. This was now purely an asset extraction operation. I opened the master banking portal. The interface displayed the interconnected web of joint accounts, high-yield savings, and the dedicated wedding fund I had foolishly established. I navigated directly to the outbound transaction ledger. There it sat, pending clearance. A $30,000 deposit earmarked for the elite catering company Megan had insisted upon. The menu included imported Wagyu and white truffles delicacies chosen specifically to impress her future in-laws. I hovered the cursor over the cancellation protocol. A standard retail bank requires verbal confirmation for amounts exceeding $10,000, but my private wealth manager had established a direct terminal for my authorization. I typed in my biometric passcode. I clicked the prompt. The system processed the request for exactly 4 seconds. A green banner flashed across the screen, confirming the unilateral stop payment. The funds were instantly yanked back from the vendor's holding account. The bank's automated security matrix immediately generated a cancellation alert. I watched the digital timestamp confirm the email dispatch directly to Megan's phone. The first pillar of her perfect day had just collapsed. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the absolute silence of the study settle over me. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 10 minutes passed before the serene quiet of the villa shattered. A sharp, piercing shriek echoed from the grand hallway, followed by the frantic slapping of bare feet against the marble floors. Megan was running. The heavy oak door of my study violently rattled in its frame. She pounded her fists against the wood, the impacts frantic and demanding. The brass handle jerked up and down as she tried to force her way inside. Her voice bled through the thick timber, shrill and dripping with unmasked panic. She screamed that a banking error had just destroyed her catering reservation. She demanded I open the door. She ordered me to fix it immediately. Her tone held no request, only the entitled expectation of a subordinate rectifying a catastrophic mistake. I let her strike the door 3 more times. I wanted the desperation to fully take root in her mind. I picked up my phone, opening a blank dialing screen to complete the charade. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Megan nearly stumbled into the room, her face flushed red, clutching her phone like a weapon. She shoved the illuminated screen toward my face, pointing furiously at the bold red text of the cancellation notice. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump slightly. I adopted the mild, confused expression of an aging man overwhelmed by modern technology. I looked at the screen, furrowing my brow. I told her I had just been on hold with the fraud department. I lied with absolute conviction, explaining that the bank's security algorithm must have flagged the massive transfer as suspicious activity. I rubbed my temples, claiming the automated system had locked the entire portfolio, pending a mandatory 48-hour security review. Megan gasped, her eyes widening in sheer horror. She stated the caterer would release her date by tomorrow morning if the deposit was not secured. I offered a helpless shrug, apologizing for the inconvenience of banking regulations. The 48-hour window was secured. It was exactly the operational silence I needed to liquidate the rest of the assets without interruption. Megan paced the length of my study, biting her thumbnail. She could not accept defeat. The facade of the elegant bride vanished, replaced by a ruthless pragmatism I recognized from my days in corporate negotiations. She marched back to my desk, reaching into the pocket of her designer cardigan. She aggressively tossed a heavy black metal credit card onto my keyboard. It landed with a sharp clatter. She instructed me to call the caterer and use this card to hold the reservation until my accounts unfroze. She proudly declared it was Travis's corporate expense card. She claimed his boutique logistics firm gave him an unlimited allowance for high-tier client relations. It was the exact lie Diane had fed me months ago to justify why Travis never seemed to pay for his own meals. Megan spun around and marched out of the study, leaving the door wide open. I could hear her heels clicking down the hallway as she shouted for her mother to pour another glass of wine. I sat back down in my chair. I picked up the heavy metal card. The tactile weight felt incredibly familiar. It was identical to the high-level corporate procurement accounts I used to issue to my regional directors back when I ran the Western Seaboard supply routes. I flipped the card over to verify the billing details in the security code. My eyes scanned the embossed silver lettering across the bottom left corner. The name printed on the front did not say Travis. The plastic bore a completely different legal name. It belonged to a defunct corporate entity I instantly recognized from my days investigating phantom shipping manifests and shell companies. I slid the card into an encrypted card reader attached to my terminal. I bypassed the standard authorization gateway and pinged the routing number against a global freight database. The system returned a blaring red alert. The account was tied to a notorious offshore holding firm currently under active federal investigation for wire fraud. The man marrying my stepdaughter was not a successful logistics executive. He was operating under a stolen identity using a blacklisted corporate card to fund his lifestyle. A new, far more dangerous conflict immediately presented itself right on my desk. I held the heavy metal credit card up to the ambient light of my dual monitors. The embossed silver lettering across the bottom corner read, "Sterling Freight Solutions." I recognized the corporate shell structure instantly. During my tenure as a regional director for a global shipping conglomerate, my fraud division spent months dismantling ghost vendors operating under that exact umbrella. Travis was not a boutique logistics executive negotiating high-tier client relations. He was a grifter wearing a tailored suit utilizing a fabricated corporate identity. I needed verifiable data to confirm the scope of the liability. I opened a secure terminal application bypassing standard internet protocols. When I retired, I retained administrative access to an international freight registry, a vital perk of building the system architecture from the ground up. I typed the card's routing number directly into the database. The query bypassed domestic banking firewalls and pulled raw incorporation data. The results populated my screen in sterile green text. Travis did not exist. The man sleeping in my guest room, drinking my vintage scotch, and marrying my stepdaughter was utilizing a completely stolen identity. His real name was buried under layers of defunct limited liability companies and dissolved offshore accounts. The financial footprint was glaringly obvious to a trained auditor. The system revealed a sprawling web of defaulted credit lines, aggressive collections, and outstanding civil judgments. I initiated a deeper search cross-referencing his shell company's registered addresses with domestic property records. The next page of the audit made my blood run entirely cold. Travis and Megan had legally tethered Sterling Freight Solutions to my coastal villa. They had actively utilized my home address to secure 3 massive fraudulent business loans over the past 8 months. They were not merely arrogant. They were preparing to let the federal government seize my property the moment their fabricated enterprise inevitably collapsed. The heavy oak door to my study swung open without a knock. Diane walked in. She wore a silk evening robe carrying her empty wineglass by the stem. She did not look at my monitors. She did not acknowledge the fact that her daughter had just exiled me from my own family in the adjacent dining room. Diane walked directly to my desk and dropped a glossy brochure over my keyboard. It was a customized mock-up for a massive ice sculpture featuring 2 interlocking swans. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail against the quoted price at the bottom of the page. She stated the vendor required an immediate $10,000 cashier's check to secure the sculptor for the reception. She demanded I write it right now. Her voice carried the bored impatience of a manager thwarting an incompetent subordinate. There was no apology for Megan's profound cruelty. There was no attempt to mediate the hostility. There was only the expectation of endless financial compliance. I looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 2 decades. I searched her eyes for any trace of the partner I once believed she was. I saw the absolute absence of loyalty. She was simply a parasite demanding another meal entirely indifferent to the host she was slowly draining. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or mention the federal fraud currently displaying on the monitor, hidden just behind her brochure. I uncapped my fountain pen. I wrote a check for $10,000, signing my name with deliberate, smooth strokes. I tore the slip from the binding and handed it to her. Diane snatched the paper, offered a dismissive nod, and turned her back to me. She walked out of the study entirely satisfied with her presumed dominance. She did not know the check was drawn from a dormant legacy account. That specific routing number belonged to a high-yield savings portfolio I had formally instructed my wealth manager to liquidate and close effective at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. By the time the ice sculptor attempted to deposit the funds, the account would mathematically cease to exist. The check would bounce violently, severing yet another critical vendor from the carefully choreographed wedding itinerary. I watched the door click shut behind her. The remaining shreds of my marital loyalty vanished, replaced by cold, mechanical execution. I picked up my encrypted phone. I dialed a private number I had not used in 6 years. Warren answered on the second ring. Warren was a ruthless corporate liquidator, a man who specialized in hostile asset extraction and quiet, brutal bankruptcies. We had worked together dismantling failing shipping depots in the Rust Belt during the late 90s. He did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed to liquidate a prime coastal asset immediately. I gave him the address of the villa I was currently sitting inside. Warren paused, asking about the standard market approach and the potential for bidding wars on such a premium estate. I vetoed the idea entirely. I instructed him to completely bypass the public listings. I needed an immediate cash buyer willing to transfer funds within 48 hours. Warren warned me that an expedited timeline would demand a massive, almost irrational reduction in the asking price. I told him the final price was utterly irrelevant. The speed of the transaction was the only metric that mattered. Warren chuckled softly, the sound dry and calculating. He asked if my wife would contest the sudden sale of our primary residence, noting that spousal consent usually delayed hostile liquidations. I opened my digital safe and pulled up the original property deed. I reminded Warren of the ironclad prenuptial agreement I had insisted upon 20 years ago, a document Diane had mocked but ultimately signed because she was drowning in consumer debt at the time. The villa was legally registered solely under my name. Diane held zero equity, zero leverage, and zero rights to the property. Warren promised to have a foreign investment firm on standby by tomorrow afternoon. I ended the call. The trap was definitively set. My family believed they were securing their luxurious future. They were actually sleeping inside a house that would completely cease to be theirs before the weekend arrived. Warren operated with terrifying efficiency. By 9 the next morning, a sleek silver sedan rolled up the crushed gravel driveway, crunching softly against the stones. A man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit stepped out carrying a titanium briefcase. His name was Victor, though the gold-embossed badge clipped to his lapel identified him as a senior risk assessor for a boutique wedding insurance firm. Diane and Megan had already departed in a flurry of garment bags, aggressively complaining about the local seamstress failing to understand the intricate vision for the bridal gown. They left me strict instructions not to let the caterer inside the kitchen if he arrived early. I welcomed Victor through the double oak doors. We did not exchange pleasantries. He immediately unlatched his briefcase, bypassing standard greetings to extract a high-precision laser measuring device. We started in the east wing. He scanned the dimensions of the vaulted ceilings and the imported Italian marble flooring. Every beep of his device quantified the exact liquidation value of the life I had built and funded. We progressed to the second floor, moving methodically through the expansive guest suites. Victor was meticulously photographing the master suite's panoramic ocean view when heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs. The rhythm was entirely wrong. It was too fast, too aggressive. The bedroom door swung open violently, striking the wall, stop with a loud crack. Travis stood in the threshold. He wore his usual tailored blazer, but his tie was loosened, and a distinct sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He held a brass master key in his left hand. I had never given him one. Travis locked eyes with Victor, completely ignoring my presence in the corner of the room. He marched directly toward the appraiser, his jaw clenched, deliberately invading Victor's personal space. He demanded to know exactly what was happening in the master suite. He ordered Victor to produce his corporate identification, reaching aggressively toward the lanyard on the man's lapel. Travis claimed he managed the security logistics for the entire wedding and needed to verify all vendor credentials instantly. He tried to project absolute dominance, attempting to bully the stranger out of the room. I stepped out from the shadow of the heavy velvet curtains. I told Travis to take his hands off the inspector. Travis spun around, his expression morphing into a patronizing smirk. He told me to relax, claiming he was just protecting the family assets from opportunistic contractors looking to exploit the wedding chaos. He took another step toward Victor, puffing out his chest. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked him how the freight logistics business was holding up under the specific legal name printed on his black corporate card. I spoke the exact registered title of the offshore holding company aloud. The syllables hit the room like a physical shockwave. I detailed the routing numbers associated with the defunct entity. I mentioned the global fraud registry. Travis froze completely. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by the stark, hollow look of a cornered predator. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hands slowly lowered to his sides, the master key slipping from his grip to hit the floorboards with a sharp clatter. I walked toward him, maintaining unbroken eye contact, utilizing the exact physical posturing I used to break hostile executives during corporate buyouts in the late 90s. I informed him that I retained administrative access to the international shipping database. I listed the precise monetary values of his defaulted credit lines. I referenced the 3 fraudulent business loans tied directly to my residential address. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to vacate my property before I forwarded the compiled audit directly to the federal authorities. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and held my thumb deliberately over the send button. Travis did not attempt to negotiate. He did not offer a single excuse or fabricated lie. He understood the lethal precision of a superior logistical strike. He turned and sprinted down the staircase, nearly tripping over the mahogany runner in his haste. I walked to the window and watched him throw himself into the driver's seat of his leased sports car. Before putting the vehicle in gear, he frantically typed a message on his phone. I recognized the desperate, rapid speed of his thumbs. He was sending a coded, frantic alert to Megan. The element of total surprise was officially compromised. The 48-hour window of operational silence I had secured yesterday was collapsing rapidly. They would connect the dots within the hour. The defensive shield was gone, forcing my timeline into critical overdrive. Victor finished logging the square footage of the master bath entirely unbothered by the altercation. He possessed the cold professionalism Warren demanded of his associates. He packed the laser device back into his titanium case. He looked at his tablet and confirmed the structural valuation matched Warren's initial aggressive estimates. Victor snapped the briefcase shut. He delivered the final parameters with absolute clinical detachment. An international holding consortium was prepared to wire the full cash amount directly into my blind trust within 24 hours. They accepted the hyper-expedited timeline without a single financial contingency, but they enforced one absolute non-negotiable stipulation. The property had to be entirely vacant by noon tomorrow. No occupants, no furniture, no lingering trace of the wedding preparations. The buyer required absolute physical possession to clear their own tax liabilities before the end of the fiscal quarter. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. Tomorrow was the exact date Megan had scheduled her extravagant bridal shower in the grand hall downstairs. Elite caterers were set to arrive at 10 in the morning to set up the champagne towers and the imported caviar stations. Clearing a 10,000-square-foot coastal villa in under 24 hours defied every standard metric of residential relocation. It was a logistical nightmare requiring ruthless execution. I extended my hand to Victor. I instructed him to authorize the wire transfer immediately. I guaranteed the house would be completely empty, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision between Diane's opulent social event and my absolute financial severance. The drive into the financial district was a straight line down the interstate, taking me far away from the ocean breeze and into a canyon of steel and reflective glass. I parked in the subterranean garage of a 60-story high-rise, taking the express elevator directly to the 42nd floor. The doors parted to reveal the reception area of Warren's firm. There were no warm colors here, no plush seating or welcoming art. It was a sterile, hyper-efficient environment designed for corporate liquidations and hostile acquisitions. Warren stood waiting for me behind the glass walls of his corner conference room. We skipped the formalities. He pointed to a leather chair across the slate table. I sat down, expecting to immediately review the final closing documents for the villa. Instead, Warren reached into his leather portfolio and slid a single manila folder across the smooth slate surface. He told me his background team had run a mandatory deep sweep on the property title to ensure a clean transfer for the foreign buyer. They found an anomaly, a massive one. I opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a secondary mortgage application filed with a major national bank. The requested loan amount was for $300,000 secured directly against the equity of my coastal estate. My eyes snapped to the timestamp in the upper right corner. The application had been digitally submitted and physically signed a mere 48 hours ago. That was precisely the time frame when Diane had claimed she was visiting a coastal winery with her friends to decompress before the wedding weekend. I scanned down to the bottom of the final page. There, sitting on the designated borrower line, was my signature. It was an exceptionally good forgery. The loop of the capital letter and the sharp, aggressive cross of the consonant were nearly identical to my actual handwriting. Most tellers or automated systems would never have flagged it. But looking closely, I saw the subtle hesitation in the ink flow, a slight tremor in the cursive that I instantly recognized. Diane had spent 20 years watching me sign contracts, invoices, and tax returns. She had practiced this. She had carefully, deliberately committed a federal crime to extract $333,000 in cash from a house she did not own, leaving me entirely liable for the debt. My pulse did not race. It slowed to a steady, rhythmic thud. The residual sting of yesterday's humiliation in the dining room evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. Diane and her daughter were not just ungrateful dependents. They were active predators. They had anticipated my eventual breaking point and decided to financially gut me before I could cut them off. I placed the forged document flat on the table, aligning its edges perfectly with the slate. I looked up at Warren. He was watching me with the detached curiosity of a surgeon, waiting for the anesthesia to take effect. I asked him if the loan had been funded yet. He confirmed the bank was still in the mandatory underwriting phase, meaning the cash had not yet cleared into Diane's hidden accounts. I instructed Warren to contact the bank's Central Fraud Division immediately. I explicitly ordered him not to block the application, but to quietly notify the federal investigators that a fraudulent transaction was currently in progress. We were going to let Diane walk willingly into a federal trap. By the time the bank requested her physical presence to finalize the disbursement, they would have a squad of investigators waiting in the lobby. With the criminal liability successfully outsourced to the authorities, we pivoted to the primary objective. Warren extracted a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. These were the expedited sale contracts. The foreign holding company had completed their end of the transaction with ruthless speed. The buyer was a decentralized shell corporation operating out of Luxembourg, utilizing untraceable offshore capital. They did not care about the coastal views or the imported marble. They only care about parking their wealth in American real estate. I picked up my pen. I did not read the boilerplate clauses. I flipped directly to the signature pages. Every stroke of my pen legally severed a piece of the life I had funded for 2 decades. I signed away the vaulted ceilings, the oceanfront patio, and the mahogany dining room, where I had been told my presence was a burden. The transaction was absolute. The title transferred entirely to the foreign entity, rendering my former home a corporate asset. The liquidation of the real estate was only half the battle. I needed to ensure Diane had zero access to capital when the inevitable fallout occurred. Warren logged into his secure terminal, sharing his screen with me. I handed him my master security fob, granting him full administrative override on all my domestic portfolios. We targeted the joint marital accounts first. Because the bank would be actively investigating the forged mortgage application, we had immediate legal justification to initiate a total freeze on all shared assets. I watched Warren execute the command. The joint checking, the shared high-yield savings, and the emergency credit lines all shifted from active to permanently locked. Diane could not withdraw a single cent. Her debit cards would decline instantly. The luxury lifestyle she had grown accustomed to was abruptly shut off at the source, leaving her with whatever cash she currently carried in her designer purse. We moved to my personal liquid wealth. The remaining millions scattered across various mutual funds and domestic brokerage accounts needed to be entirely insulated from the impending divorce proceedings. Warren had preemptively established a blind trust in a jurisdiction notorious for its impenetrable privacy laws. I authorized the mass transfer. The screen flickered as millions of dollars digitally evaporated from the United States banking system, reassembling securely within an untouchable corporate vault. I was legally removed as the direct beneficiary, appointing a trusted proxy to manage the funds until the dust settled. If Diane attempted to sue for alimony or emotional distress damages, her aggressive divorce attorneys would find absolutely nothing to attach a lien to. My domestic net worth was mathematically reduced to zero. The concept of a blind trust is often misunderstood by those outside elite financial circles. It is not merely a hiding place, it is a legal fortress. By transferring my wealth into this specific structure, I was willingly surrendering day-to-day control of my assets to an independent trustee. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its absolute opacity. Because I had no legal right to dictate the investment strategy or access the funds on demand, the courts could not compel me to liquidate it for a divorce settlement. Diane's lawyers would inevitably subpoena my financial records, expecting to find a treasure trove of stocks, bonds, and liquid cash. Instead, they would hit a reinforced concrete wall. They would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, attempting to pierce the corporate veil, only to discover that the husband she thought she could bleed dry had vanished, leaving behind a destitute man who legally owned nothing but the clothes on his back. I stood up from the slate table, adjusting my jacket. I had walked into the high-rise burdened by decades of financial liability, tethered to a woman who viewed me as nothing more than a host organism. I was leaving the building completely unburdened. I possessed no property in my name. I held no active domestic bank accounts. I was a ghost in the financial system. Warren shook my hand, his grip firm and strictly professional. He promised to monitor the fraud alert and keep the eviction crew on standby for tomorrow morning. I stepped back into the elevator, watching the doors slide shut. The descent to the ground floor felt remarkably fast. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt distinctly different in my lungs. The wedding was roughly 24 hours away. Megan was likely picking up her custom gown right now, swiping a card that was about to trigger a federal alert. Diane was likely boasting about the ice sculpture, completely unaware she had just committed a felony that would dismantle her future. I walked toward my car with a light, measured step, entirely ready to initiate the final phase of their destruction. I navigated the elevator back to the ground floor of the financial district. The sterile efficiency of Warren's office fading as the reality of my next operational phase set in. The drive back to Monterey was a blur of highway lines and a singular focused objective. The blind trust was secured. The forged mortgage was flagged by the federal authorities. The foreign buyer was preparing the wire transfer for the villa. Now I needed to systematically dismantle the immediate physical infrastructure of the wedding. Every vendor, every floral arrangement, every ounce of caviar funded by my accounts had to be excised before the afternoon was over. I was going to surgically remove myself from the event, leaving Travis and Diane holding a massive empty bag. I pulled into the cobblestone driveway of the villa. The ocean breeze carried the faint scent of salt and the impending storm. The house was quiet save for the rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffside. Diane and Megan were undoubtedly still occupied with the dress fitting, completely unaware of the financial guillotine currently descending upon them. I bypassed the front door, entering through the garage. I walked directly to my study, ignoring the subtle signs of their occupation: a discarded silk scarf on the banister, a half-empty bottle of expensive champagne on the kitchen island. I sat at my desk and pulled up the master contact list for the wedding vendors. I had the contracts saved in a secured folder, a habit born from decades of managing complex corporate logistics. I needed to ensure every cancellation was legally bulletproof. I would not allow them to retain a single petal of those imported orchids. I dialed the number for the luxury coastal venue, a premier estate known for its cliffside ceremonies and exorbitant fees. The event coordinator, a woman named Sarah, answered with practiced, bubbly enthusiasm. She recognized my voice instantly, probably assuming I was calling to add another overpriced tier to the open bar. I cut through her pleasantries immediately. I informed her that I was formally invoking the fraud clause embedded in Section 4 of our vendor agreement. I stated that the secondary payment method provided to secure the final catering reservation was a blacklisted corporate card tied to an active federal wire fraud investigation. I gave her the specific name of the defunct shell company embossed on Travis's card. The bubbly enthusiasm evaporated from her voice. The silence on the line was thick and immediate. I could practically hear her furiously scrolling through the payment records. I told her I was officially canceling all remaining financial guarantees tied to the event, and recommended she immediately notify her legal department regarding the fraudulent card attempt. I hung up before she could ask a single follow-up question. The first domino had been pushed. I moved down the list. I contacted the luxury transport company, a fleet of high-end sedans scheduled to shuttle the VIP guests from the airport. I utilized the same precise language. I invoked the fraud clauses. I detailed the blacklisted payment method. I formally withdrew my financial backing. The response was identical: immediate panic followed by swift, unceremonious cancellation. I repeated the process with the florist in Holland, ensuring the $25,000 worth of white orchids would never leave the shipping depot. Every call was a methodical extraction. I was stripping away the opulence, leaving the raw, ugly reality of their financial desperation exposed. By the time I finished the final call, the entire wedding infrastructure had been effectively vaporized. There would be no champagne fountain. There would be no luxury transport. There would be no venue. I closed my laptop and stood up. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a heavy canvas duffel bag. I did not pack clothes or sentimental items. I only packed the essentials: my encrypted hard drives, hard copies of the forged mortgage application, and the finalized property transfer documents from Warren's office. I slung the duffel over my shoulder and walked out to the garage. I popped the trunk of my sedan and tossed the bag inside. I reached for my golf clubs leaning against the far wall. It was a mundane action, a sharp contrast to the massive financial detonation I had just orchestrated. I hoisted the heavy leather bag, the familiar clatter of the irons echoing in the cavernous space. As I turned back toward my car, a sharp, aggressive screech of tires pierced the quiet afternoon. Diane's luxury SUV swung wildly into the cobblestone driveway, braking erratically inches from my rear bumper. The driver's side door flew open before the vehicle had fully stopped. Diane stormed out, her face a mask of furious, unhinged rage. Her silk blouse was rumpled, and she clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. She marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the stones. She did not ask questions. She launched directly into a tirade. She screamed that the venue coordinator had just called her, threatening a massive lawsuit for attempting to secure the final catering deposit with a fraudulent credit card. She demanded to know what I had done. She yelled that I was ruining her daughter's life, that I was a vindictive, controlling monster. I calmly slid the golf clubs into the trunk. I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge the venom in her voice. I closed the trunk with a solid, satisfying thud. Diane was practically hyperventilating, stepping closer, her voice escalating to a shrill pitch. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. She declared that she was filing for divorce immediately. She promised to take half of everything I owned. She threatened to drag my name through the mud in every social circle on the coast. She claimed she would leave me destitute and completely alone. She was projecting absolute dominance, attempting to utilize the threat of legal destruction to force my compliance. It was a strategy she had probably used countless times in her past. It was entirely ineffective now. I walked to the driver's side door and opened it. I slid into the leather seat, the engine humming to life with a push of a button. I rolled down the window. Diane stood inches from the car, her chest heaving, waiting for me to beg, waiting for me to apologize and fix the catastrophic mess she believed I had created. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a crisp white envelope. I held it out the window. Diane snatched it, her face twisting in confusion. She ripped open the flap. Inside was a high-resolution photocopy of the secondary mortgage application she had filed 2 days ago. The $300,000 loan request, the explicit details of the coastal villa, and at the bottom of the final page, the flawless, expertly forged signature she had practiced for 20 years. I watched her eyes scan the document. I watched the aggressive, entitled fury completely drain from her face. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickening, ashen white. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. She looked at the paper, then looked at me, the terrifying realization of her federal liability finally sinking in. She knew she was caught. She knew the trap had been sprung. I did not offer a single word of explanation. I shifted the car into drive. The tires crunched softly against the cobblestones as I pulled away, leaving her standing entirely alone in the driveway, clutching the undeniable proof of her own destruction. I pulled my sedan into the subterranean parking structure of the Grand Regency Hotel on the opposite side of the city. The concrete pillars and fluorescent lighting offered a stark visual shift from the coastal sunshine I had just left behind. I carried my heavy canvas duffel bag through the private elevator banks and checked into a corner executive suite on the 35th floor. The room was a sterile expanse of gray slate glass and polished chrome. It suited my current mindset perfectly. I set my bag on the king-sized bed and immediately unpacked my encrypted laptop. Before I could even connect to the secure network, my burner phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. It was Warren. His voice lacked any trace of casual greeting. He simply stated the transaction was complete. The massive wire transfer from the Luxembourg holding company had bypassed domestic gateways and successfully landed in my untouchable offshore blind trust. I was now completely liquid. The coastal villa legally belonged to a faceless corporate entity. But Warren quickly followed the confirmation with a critical complication. The foreign buyer was enforcing a brutal stipulation tied to their own corporate tax liabilities. They required absolute physical possession of the property by noon tomorrow. If the house was not entirely vacated, broom swept, and devoid of all occupants by 12 o'clock, the holding company would trigger a penalty clause clawing back 20% of the purchase price. I checked my watch. It was currently 4 in the afternoon. I had exactly 20 hours to empty a 10,000 square foot estate. Any normal man would panic. Any normal man would beg for an extension. I did neither. I looked at the calendar synchronization on my tablet. Tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, Megan was scheduled to host her extravagant bridal shower in the villa's grand hall. She had spent the last 2 months boasting about this specific event to her elite social circle. 40 women of high society were expected to arrive in their finest daytime couture. She had contracted a private string quartet and ordered a custom champagne tasting menu. They were going to occupy the exact space the foreign buyer demanded empty. I told Warren I understood the terms. I did not ask for a grace period. I ended the call and opened a fresh terminal window on my laptop. During my time managing international freight routes, I occasionally had to deal with hostile warehouse foreclosures. When a regional distributor went bankrupt and refused to vacate a critical logistics hub, we did not use standard moving companies. We used specialized extraction crews. I dialed a local contact, a man named Marcus, who ran an industrial clearing service out of Oakland. Marcus specialized in rapid, uncompromising commercial evictions. His men were bonded, insured, and entirely devoid of empathy, Marcus answered with a gruff acknowledgement. I bypassed the standard negotiation process. I gave him the address of the Monterey Villa and told him I needed a full structural clean-out. Every piece of furniture, every imported rug, every chandelier, and every remaining wedding decoration had to be boxed, loaded, and removed. I told him the operation had to be completed before noon tomorrow. Marcus laughed out loud, stating that clearing an estate of that magnitude in a few hours was physically impossible with a standard crew. I did not argue. I offered him triple his highest emergency rate entirely in untraceable cash. The laughter stopped. Marcus asked for the specific rules of engagement. I laid out the operational parameters with absolute clarity. I told him I was sending over a digitally signed authorization proving the property had changed hands and granting him full legal jurisdiction to enter the premises. I warned him that the house would not be empty when he arrived. I explained that a large, opulent social event would be actively taking place in the main hall. I instructed him to ignore every single person inside the building. His crew was to breach the front doors at exactly 11:30 in the morning. They were to systematically dismantle the environment from the inside out. If a guest was sitting on a chair, his men were to politely ask them to stand and then remove the chair. If a catered meal was placed on a dining table, they were to box the table right out from under the silverware. Marcus went completely silent on the line. He processed the magnitude of the instructions. He asked me what his men should do if the occupants became hostile or threatened police action. I told him to let them call the authorities. I guaranteed that local law enforcement could not stop a legally sanctioned property extraction backed by a finalized deed of sale. I assured him that the woman running the event would have zero legal standing to halt his progress. I reiterated that his only metric for success was an empty house by 12 o'clock. I transferred 50% of his tripled cash rate into his holding account instantly to prove my intent. Marcus confirmed the deposit hit his ledger. He promised me he would mobilize a fleet of 3 heavy-duty commercial moving trucks and deploy 20 of his most efficient men. He guaranteed they would hit the property line exactly on schedule. I severed the connection and dropped the burner phone onto the glass table. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of the hotel suite, looking out over the sprawling city grid. The traffic below moved in organized, predictable patterns. I had spent my entire life organizing supply lines, predicting variables, and ensuring flawless execution. Tomorrow I was going to apply those exact same principles to dismantle the life of a woman who had tried to forge my signature and steal my future. I ordered a black coffee from room service and sat back down at my terminal. I needed to meticulously track the legal fallout of the frozen joint accounts. The trap was locked. The extraction crew was briefed. The countdown to noon had officially begun. 40 women of coastal high society occupy the grand hall of the villa, completely insulated from the financial demolition I had orchestrated the day before. Crystal flutes chime against one another in a constant rhythm of privilege. Megan stands at the center of the room, wearing a pristine ivory cocktail dress, holding court as the undisputed center of attention. Diane hovers nearby, pouring vintage champagne and accepting compliments on the sheer scale of the estate. A private string quartet plays softly in the corner, masking the sound of the ocean wind outside. They are living their absolute fantasy, completely reliant on the illusion that this wealth is permanently theirs. That illusion shatters at exactly 11:30 in the morning. The delicate classical music is suddenly drowned out by the aggressive guttural roar of heavy diesel engines. The sheer volume rattles the floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 massive industrial moving trucks do not park on the street. They bypass the front gates entirely. their heavy tires tearing deep tracks through the manicured front lawn, crushing the imported rose bushes Diane had meticulously arranged. The trucks reverse aggressively toward the main entrance, their backup alarms blaring through the elegant chatter of the bridal shower. The heavy double oak doors of the villa are pushed open so violently they strike the interior walls. Marcus and his extraction crew do not knock. 12 men march into the grand hall. They do not wear catering uniforms or polite smiles. They wear heavy canvas work boots, thick leather gloves, and industrial gray coveralls. They carry rolls of plastic wrap, heavy-duty dollies, and power drills. They move with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of a military unit executing a raid. Marcus strides directly past a group of terrified women holding cucumber sandwiches. He raises a hand, and his crew immediately splinters off to assigned sectors of the room. 2 men approach the string quartet, politely instruct the musicians to step aside, and immediately begin folding the antique Persian rug right out from under their music stands. 3 other men march toward the massive mahogany dining table where the catered brunch is displayed. They do not ask permission. They simply grab the edges of the silk tablecloth, pull it taut, and slide the entire spread of imported caviar crystal platters and silver serving trays onto the floor with a deafening crash. The room erupts into pure chaos. Women scream, dropping their champagne flutes on the marble floor. Megan stands frozen for exactly 3 seconds, her brain unable to process the violent intrusion of working-class reality into her elite fantasy. Then the entitlement kicks in. She charges toward Marcus, her face twisted in absolute fury. She screams at the top of her lungs, demanding to know who they are and who let them in. She threatens to call the police, claiming they are trespassing on private property and ruining her bridal shower. She demands they leave the premises immediately before she presses charges. Marcus does not even blink. He does not stop his crew. He watches as 4 of his men set up industrial ladders and begin using power drills to unscrew the mounting brackets of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging directly above Megan's head. He reaches into the deep pocket of his coveralls and pulls out a thick manila envelope. He steps forward and presses the envelope directly against Megan's chest. He speaks with a loud, booming voice that cuts effortlessly through the screaming guests and the whirring of power tools. He informs her that he represents the property management firm representing the new legal owners of the estate. He states clearly that the house was sold in a closed cash transaction, and the title was officially transferred at 9 o'clock this morning. He tells her the envelope contains the finalized deed of sale fully authenticated by the county clerk, along with a legally binding 24-hour notice to vacate the premises. Diane pushes her way through the panicked crowd of women, grabbing the envelope from her daughter. She rips the documents out, her eyes scanning the heavy legal text. She is looking for a loophole, a mistake, a reason to prove this is all a massive misunderstanding. Instead, she finds the ironclad signature of the foreign holding company and the absolute nullification of her residency. The blood drains entirely from Diane's face. The aggressive, threatening posture she held in the driveway yesterday completely vanishes. She realizes the photocopy I handed her was not just a threat. It was a promise I had already fulfilled. Marcus raises his voice louder, addressing the entire room of horrified society women. He announces that the property is currently under active commercial eviction. He advises all non-residents to locate the nearest exit and vacate the premises, immediately warning them that his crew is legally authorized to physically remove any remaining furniture, regardless of whether someone is currently sitting on it. To demonstrate his point, 2 movers flank the velvet antique sofa where the mother of the groom is sitting. They tip the sofa forward without a word, forcing the woman to scramble to her feet before they hoist the heavy piece of furniture onto a dolly and wheel it out the front door. The social elite do not handle sudden poverty well. The 40 women in the room look at the moving crew, then look at Megan, and finally look at the eviction notice trembling in Diane's hands. The connection is instantaneous. They realize Megan is not the wealthy heiress to a coastal fortune. They realize the entire display of luxury is a complete fraud. The social contagion of embarrassment spreads through the room faster than fire. Nobody wants to be associated with an eviction. Nobody wants to be present when the police inevitably arrive. The mass exodus begins. The guests do not offer apologies. They do not stop to comfort the weeping bride. They abandon their half-empty glasses and rush toward the front doors, pushing past the moving crew in a desperate bid to reach their luxury vehicles. Megan tries to grab the arm of her maid of honor, begging her to stay, pleading that this is all a terrible mistake caused by her vindictive stepfather. The maid of honor pulls her arm away, her face a mask of profound second-hand embarrassment. She mutters a quick excuse and practically sprints out of the grand hall. Within 10 minutes, the 40 guests have completely vanished. The driveway is empty, save for the 3 massive moving trucks actively swallowing the contents of the house. Megan stands completely alone in the center of the grand hall. The imported caviar is smeared across the marble floor. The crystal flutes are shattered. The walls are rapidly becoming bare as Marcus's crew strips the expensive artwork from the plaster. The illusion of her elite status, the foundation of her entire social identity, has been systematically dismantled in front of everyone she cares about. Diane slumps onto a wooden packing crate, staring blankly at the eviction notice. She finally understands the sheer scale of the retaliation she triggered when she forged my name on that mortgage document. They have no caterer. They have no venue. They have no home. The bridal shower is dead, and the wedding itself is now an absolute impossibility. I watch the live feed of the extraction from a discreet security camera mounted near the ceiling, sitting comfortably in my hotel suite miles away. The operation is flawlessly executed. The extraction crew moves to the second floor, and the echo of power tools fills the empty cavernous space that used to be my home. The automatic sliding doors of the roadside motor inn parted sluggishly. They did not glide with the silent precision of the coastal estate. They rattled on unlubricated tracks. Diane stepped into the lobby first. The air smelled strongly of industrial lemon cleaner and stale chlorine from an indoor pool. Megan followed closely behind her. The train of her ruined ivory dress gathered cheap synthetic carpet fibers with every step. Travis brought up the rear. He dragged 2 oversized hard-shell suitcases across the linoleum. The wheels squeaked loudly against the floor. This was the only shelter they could secure after being physically escorted off the villa grounds by the private eviction team. They were miles inland now. The ocean views were replaced by the harsh glare of a neon vacancy sign buzzing outside the window. They approached the laminate reception desk. The aesthetic shift from imported marble to imitation wood grain was a brutal physical manifestation of their new reality. Travis stepped ahead of the 2 women. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored blazer. He was attempting to project the same unearned authority he used to bully caterers and valet drivers. He addressed the young man behind the counter. He demanded a block of 5 executive suites. He claimed the incoming wedding party required immediate accommodation due to a scheduling error at their primary venue. The receptionist typed the request into a dated computer terminal. He asked for a primary credit card to hold the reservation and cover incidental damages. Travis retrieved his black corporate card. He slapped the plastic onto the counter with practiced arrogance. The receptionist swiped the magnetic strip. The terminal beeped a harsh, flat tone. The young man looked at the screen. He swiped the card a second time. The identical flat tone echoed in the quiet lobby. The receptionist slid the card back across the laminate counter. He politely informed Travis that the transaction was declined. Travis scoffed. He snatched the card and claimed the machine was malfunctioning. He reached into his leather wallet and extracted a personal platinum card. He handed it over. The receptionist processed it. The system rejected it instantly. A line of exhausted travelers began to form behind them. Diane leaned over the counter. She pulled a gold card from her designer purse. This card was directly linked to the joint marital accounts I had instructed Warren to freeze. The receptionist ran Diane's card. The terminal screen flashed a bright red alert code. The young man frowned. He looked directly at Diane and stated that the bank had flagged the account. He informed her that an active federal hold had been placed on the routing number. The phrase hung in the stagnant air of the lobby. A federal hold is not a simple overdraft error. It is a catastrophic legal mechanism. It meant the authorities had processed Warren's tip regarding the forged secondary mortgage application. The bank's internal fraud division had triggered a cascading lockdown on every financial instrument bearing Diane's name or social security number. Her checking accounts were frozen. Her emergency credit lines were suspended. The offshore shell company Travis used to masquerade as a wealthy logistics executive had been similarly paralyzed by the federal sweep. They were completely devoid of liquid capital. Travis stared at the plastic cards scattered across the reception desk. The blood drained from his face. The reality of the federal intervention neutralized his aggressive posturing. He understood that staying in this lobby trying to force a transaction could trigger an automated alert to local law enforcement. He grabbed his cards and shoved them into his pocket. He turned his back on the receptionist and walked toward the center of the lobby. Megan rushed after him. She grabbed his arm. She desperately asked him what they were going to do about the arriving guests. She asked how they were going to pay for the rooms. Travis ripped his arm away from her grip. The movement was sharp and violent. He spun around to face her. The charming, supportive facade he had maintained for months completely evaporated. He looked at Megan with absolute disgust. He told her there were no guests arriving. He explicitly stated that the wedding was over. Megan stood paralyzed. She asked him what he was talking about. She pleaded with him to calm down and formulate a plan. Travis laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound that echoed off the cheap mirrored walls of the lobby. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. He lowered his voice, but the venom was palpable. He told Megan she was a fool. He stated that he never had any intention of marrying a woman with zero earning potential. Travis methodically dismantled her reality. He explained that his entire proposal was a calculated business acquisition. He had targeted her specifically to gain proximity to her wealthy stepfather. He detailed how he planned to leverage my corporate network and siphon investment capital through their marriage. He pointed a finger at Diane. He blamed her for ruining the entire operation by getting caught forging a mortgage document. He stated that her reckless criminal liability had brought federal investigators directly to his doorstep. He told Megan that without the coastal villa and without my bank accounts, she possessed absolutely zero value to him. He was a predator who had spent months stalking a lucrative target only to discover the vault was empty and the alarms were ringing. The travelers in the lobby watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. Megan began to weep uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands. Her entire identity was tied to the illusion of this elite union. Travis did not offer a single word of comfort. He turned and walked rapidly toward the automatic sliding doors. He abandoned his oversized suitcases in the middle of the floor. He needed to evade the impending fraud charges. He stepped into the parking lot and vanished into the fading afternoon light. Megan collapsed onto one of the vinyl lobby chairs. She sobbed heavily, her breathing erratic. Diane stood frozen by the reception desk. The magnitude of her failure was absolute. She had lost her luxurious lifestyle. She had triggered a federal investigation. She had inadvertently destroyed her daughter's future. The shock slowly mutated into a desperate feral aggression. Diane needed a target. She needed someone to blame for the catastrophic collapse of her world. She walked over to Megan. She grabbed her daughter by the shoulders and shook her violently. She demanded Megan stop crying. Diane stated that they needed to fix this immediately. She declared that I was responsible for the eviction. She claimed I was responsible for freezing the accounts. She insisted that I owed them a massive financial settlement. Megan wiped her face. The betrayal by Travis fueled a sudden sharp anger. She looked up at her mother. She demanded to know where I was hiding. She insisted we find me and force a resolution. Diane opened her purse. She pulled out her smartphone. Her credit cards were frozen, but the device still retained its cellular connection. She opened a location tracking application. Months ago, Diane had covertly linked all the devices on our shared family network to monitor my travel schedules during business trips. She scrolled past the disabled phones and inactive laptops. She found a single active signal. It was a secondary tablet I occasionally used for inventory management. The green dot on the screen was stationary. It was not transmitting from the coastal villa. It was not transmitting from my corporate office. The digital marker was blinking steadily from an industrial zoning sector on the eastern edge of the city. Diane zoomed in on the map. The address belonged to a massive remote storage facility. She showed the screen to Megan. They gathered the abandoned suitcases and marched back out through the rattling sliding doors, driven by a toxic combination of panic and revenge. The GPS coordinates directed Diane and Megan away from the manicured coastal enclaves and deep into the industrial sector of the Eastern Valley. The landscape shifted from imported palm trees to cracked asphalt and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. They arrived at the sprawling complex of corrugated steel and concrete. It was a high-security commercial storage facility, normally utilized by wholesale distributors and local manufacturing firms. Diane bypassed the main reception office. She steered her luxury SUV directly toward the automated access gate. She tailgated a delivery truck to slip past the security barrier before the mechanical arm could lower. They navigated the labyrinth of identical gray structures until they reached Sector 4. They parked haphazardly across two loading zones. Diane stepped out into the humid afternoon air. The hem of her designer skirt dragged through a puddle of stagnant motor oil. She popped the trunk of her vehicle and retrieved a heavy steel tire iron. She was operating on pure adrenaline and predatory instinct. She marched toward Unit 409, expecting to find a hidden vault of liquid assets. She assumed I had hoarded physical cash or untraceable bearer bonds to fund my sudden departure. Megan stood a few feet back, shivering despite the afternoon heat. Her ruined ivory cocktail dress looked absurd against the backdrop of industrial decay. Diane jammed the flattened end of the tire iron behind the heavy brass padlock, securing the rolling steel door. She leveraged her entire body weight against the tool. The hardened steel shackle groaned under the immense pressure. Diane gritted her teeth and shoved downward with a sudden violent motion. The internal locking mechanism shattered with a loud metallic crack. The broken padlock hit the concrete floor. What Diane did not know was that the physical lock was merely a visual deterrent. The actual security protocol was wired directly into the door track. The moment the metal seal broke, a silent alarm instantly transmitted a high-priority breach code to the central security hub and simultaneously bounced a notification directly to my encrypted tablet. Diane grabbed the metal handle and threw the rolling door upward. The heavy steel curtain rattled loudly as it coiled into the ceiling housing. They stepped into the cavernous unit. Harsh fluorescent motion sensor lights flickered to life, illuminating the space. There were no pallets of foreign currency. There were no locked safes holding offshore account codes. The unit contained exactly 20 heavy-duty cardboard banker boxes stacked with geometric precision on industrial steel shelving. Diane dropped the tire iron. She lunged toward the nearest shelf and ripped the lid off the first box. She began tearing through the contents with frantic, manic energy. She pulled out thick, leather-bound binders and stacks of categorized manila envelopes. She tossed them onto the concrete floor, expecting to find hidden wealth beneath the paperwork. Megan knelt beside the scattered pile and opened one of the heavy ledgers. The label on the spine indicated it contained historical credit card statements. Megan began to read the line items. The financial history of Diane was meticulously documented on every page. Megan saw the specific dates and exorbitant amounts of secret luxury purchases. She saw the phantom accounts her mother had opened using my corporate credit rating. The ledger provided absolute, undeniable proof that Diane had operated as a financial parasite for 2 decades, hiding massive liabilities behind a facade of domestic compliance. Diane ignored the financial records. She moved to the next stack of boxes, searching desperately for something of monetary value. She ripped open a sealed envelope, and a thick stack of glossy 8x10 photographs spilled across her designer shoes. Diane froze. She looked down at the images scattered on the concrete. They were high-resolution surveillance photographs compiled by a licensed private investigator. The pictures showed Diane entering various boutique motels and discreet upscale apartment complexes with a rotating cast of affluent local businessmen. The timestamps printed in the lower right corner of every image perfectly aligned with the dates of my international supply chain conferences. I had never confronted her with the evidence. I simply archived her infidelity, building a bulletproof portfolio of absolute moral bankruptcy. Diane dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the photographs before her daughter could see them. Her hands shook violently as she tried to shove the glossy prints back into the torn envelope. Megan did not notice the photographs. Her attention was captivated by a heavy steel lockbox sitting on the bottom shelf. The latch was already disengaged. Megan flipped the heavy metal lid open. The box contained a collection of certified banking ledgers and deeply embossed court documents. Megan pulled the top file out and began scanning the dense legal text. The paperwork detailed the specific terms of a biological child support agreement enacted 20 years ago. Megan read the name of her biological father printed clearly across the top of the settlement. For her entire life, Diane had told Megan that her father was a worthless deadbeat who had abandoned them completely and refused to provide a single dollar of financial assistance. Diane had used that fabricated narrative to foster a deep psychological dependency, making Megan believe I was her only source of stability. Megan looked at the certified bank statements attached to the court order. Her biological father had never missed a payment. He had dutifully transferred substantial sums of money into a designated custodial account on the first of every month for 2 decades. Megan flipped through the subsequent pages. She found the withdrawal slips. Diane had systematically intercepted every single monthly deposit. She had funneled the child support directly into her personal offshore accounts, utilizing the funds to finance her extravagant shopping habits and luxury spa treatments. Diane had actively stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own daughter to fund a lifestyle she could not afford. Megan dropped the files. The paper scattered across the dusty floor. She stood up slowly, looking at her mother with an expression of profound, absolute horror. The fundamental reality of her entire existence had just been violently dismantled. The mother she had blindly trusted was a sociopathic liar who had stolen her future to buy designer handbags. Megan did not yell. She asked Diane how she could do something so monstrous. Diane dropped the infidelity photos and reached toward her daughter, pleading for an opportunity to explain the missing funds. Megan recoiled violently, taking a massive step backward to avoid her touch. The silent alarm protocol completed its automated cycle. Heavy footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor outside the unit. 2 armed facility security officers wearing tactical vests stepped into the open doorway. They did not issue warnings or demand an explanation. They recognized an active breach of a high-value commercial unit. The lead guard reached out and slammed his hand against the external emergency override switch bolted to the exterior wall. The automated motor engaged instantly. The heavy steel rolling door dropped from the ceiling with a deafening industrial crash. The heavy metal curtain slammed against the concrete floor, plunging the unit into total darkness. The exterior deadbolts fired simultaneously, locking Diane and Megan inside the windowless cube. They were completely trapped, breathing the stale air of a concrete cell, surrounded by the undeniable documentary evidence of their own destruction. The guards assumed standard tactical positions outside the door, waiting for the local police department to arrive and process the felony trespassing charges. I sat in the leather chair of my executive suite on the 35th floor of the downtown hotel. The city spread out below me in a vast grid of shimmering lights. The room was perfectly silent. My encrypted laptop rested on the glass table, displaying the live feed from the concealed infrared camera I had installed in the corner of Storage Unit 409. The night vision technology rendered the footage in stark shades of green and black. I watched Diane pounding her fists desperately against the corrugated steel door. I watched Megan sitting on the concrete floor, entirely ignoring her mother, staring blankly into the darkness as her reality collapsed. I picked up the porcelain mug from the coaster. The black coffee was still hot. It tasted bitter and exceptionally clean. The timeline was fully secured. The operational objectives were achieved. The extraction was complete. I took a slow, deliberate sip and watched the inevitable arrival of the flashing police lights illuminating the edge of the industrial complex. They had walked willingly into the final trap, closing the door on their own future. I parked the leased sedan at the extreme edge of the cobblestone driveway to avoid the deep tracks left by the heavy industrial moving trucks. The expansive coastal villa stood perfectly quiet against the backdrop of the crashing ocean waves. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and pushed them open. The silence inside the estate was absolute and entirely unnatural. The air no longer carried the scent of imported floral arrangements or expensive catering preparations. It smelled exclusively of industrial floor cleaner and bare plaster. Marcus and his extraction team had executed their mandate with terrifying and ruthless precision. The vast grand hall had been stripped down to the foundational subflooring. The vaulted ceilings hung over a cavernous, echoing void. Every landscape painting, every hand-woven rug, and every piece of custom mahogany furniture had been surgically removed from the premises. My footsteps echoed sharply against the bare walls as I navigated the empty corridors. The physical manifestation of my former domestic life had been systematically erased in under 2 hours. I conducted my final walkthrough with clinical detachment. The representatives from the foreign holding company were scheduled to arrive for their physical possession inspection in exactly 45 minutes. I needed to verify the structural integrity of the property perfectly matched our transfer agreements. I moved into the expansive kitchen area. The massive Italian marble island was the sole fixture remaining in the space. It sat like a cold gray altar in the exact center of the vast empty room. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder. I placed it down directly in the center of the polished marble surface. The slap of the heavy paper echoed softly in the vacant kitchen. The contents of that folder represented the final definitive nail in the coffin of Travis and his fabricated corporate empire. It contained the unredacted federal wire fraud docket numbers. It held the direct communication transcripts between Warren's legal team and the federal investigators who were currently dismantling Travis' operation. It also contained a detailed ledger of every single offshore account Travis had attempted to use to siphon my assets, all of which were currently frozen by strict government mandate. I placed a single brass paperweight on top of the folder to keep it perfectly aligned with the edges of the stone. I checked the time on my wristwatch. The extraction timeline was flowing perfectly on schedule. A sudden violent crash shattered the pristine silence of the villa. The deafening sound of breaking glass erupted from the rear of the property. I turned slowly toward the back patio entrance. The heavy reinforced glass door had been smashed completely inward. Shards of thick safety glass rained down onto the bare hardwood floors. A figure climbed clumsily through the shattered frame, tearing his jacket on the jagged edges of the metal casing. It was Travis. He did not possess the arrogant, tailored posture of the man who had attempted to bully my property appraiser just a few days ago. His physical deterioration was rapid and staggering. His designer shirt was soaked in sweat and heavily stained with garden dirt. His breathing was ragged and extremely shallow. He held a heavy iron crowbar in his right hand. The metal tool trembled uncontrollably in his tight grip. His eyes were wide, manic, and darting frantically around the stripped interior of the house. He registered the absolute emptiness of the space as the reality of my complete financial extraction hit his desperate mind. He spotted me standing perfectly still behind the marble island. Travis charged into the kitchen. The broken glass crunched violently under his leather shoes with every rapid step. He closed the distance between us, brandishing the crowbar like a cornered and highly unpredictable predator. He slammed the heavy iron tool onto the marble island, cracking the polished edge of the stone. He did not ask any questions about the missing furniture. He issued frantic demands. He screamed that his offshore accounts were entirely locked out. He yelled that his passports had been permanently flagged by the Federal Transportation Authority. He claimed the authorities had raided his hotel room less than an hour ago and seized his primary laptops. He was an active fugitive. He demanded liquid cash. He ordered me to open my wall safe and surrender every untraceable asset I had kept on the premises. He threatened to cave my skull in if I did not provide him with enough funds to cross the southern border before the federal warrants were officially publicized across the national databases. He was relying entirely on physical intimidation to extract a final survival payout. He believed raw, desperate violence could override a meticulously engineered logistical strike. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back from the marble counter. I maintained my dominant physical position across the island. I looked directly into his manic, bloodshot eyes. I slid my right hand casually into my trouser pocket. My thumb traced the smooth plastic housing of a small remote transmitter. I had instructed Marcus to install a localized high-decibel security system during the extraction process, specifically for this potential scenario. I pressed the primary activation button with my thumb. The acoustic assault was instantaneous and overwhelming. A deafening, piercing siren erupted from hidden speakers mounted deep within the ceiling vents. The sheer volume of the alarm caused Travis to drop the heavy iron crowbar immediately. The metal clattered against the stone floor. He clamped both of his hands tightly over his ears as his face twisted in genuine physical pain. I calmly stepped around the edge of the marble island. The wail of approaching police cruisers began to bleed into the shrill sound of the internal house alarm. The authorities were responding to the automated breach protocol I had just triggered with the remote. I pointed directly at the manila folder sitting undisturbed on the marble counter. I told Travis in a calm, measured voice that his entire future was printed on those pages. I turned my back on him. I walked steadily toward the interior garage entrance. I did not look over my shoulder to see his reaction. I opened the heavy steel door and stepped into the secure concrete corridor. I let the reinforced mechanical locks engage behind me with a heavy metallic slam. I walked to my sedan and started the engine. The sound of sirens grew deafening outside the perimeter walls. I drove down the private access road, leaving Travis trapped inside the echoing villa, waiting for the federal authorities to walk through the shattered glass door. I monitored the high-definition security feed from the quiet isolation of my executive hotel suite. The flashing red and blue lights of the local patrol cruisers painted the walls of the empty Grand Hall in frantic, rhythmic strobes. 3 police vehicles skidded onto the cobblestone driveway, blocking the exit route entirely. 4 armed officers stepped out of their cars, moving with cautious, tactical precision. They were responding to a high-priority perimeter breach alert, triggered directly by my remote transmitter. They cleared the vacant foyer, sweeping their flashlights across the bare walls before pushing toward the rear of the estate. The officers moved silently through the dining room, their heavy boots squeaking slightly against the polished hardwood floors. Travis remained in the kitchen, completely oblivious to the approaching authorities. He was frantically pulling at the empty mahogany cabinets, desperate to find a hidden safe or a stash of emergency cash. His breathing was ragged and loud, echoing off the marble surfaces. He was operating in a state of pure panic, entirely consumed by the collapse of his fraudulent corporate empire. The lead officer stepped into the kitchen doorway and shouted a sharp command to freeze. Travis spun around wildly. He raised the heavy iron crowbar in his right hand. It was a reflexive, utterly disastrous decision born from pure desperation. The officers did not hesitate to neutralize the threat. 2 of them rushed forward, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. One officer grabbed his forearm, twisting the crowbar free with brutal efficiency. The heavy metal tool clattered loudly against the stone tiles. The second officer swept his legs out from under him. Travis hit the ground with a sickening thud, his chin slamming directly into the Italian marble. The officers drove their knees between his shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the floor. They pulled his arms violently behind his back and engaged the steel handcuffs. One of the officers conducted a rapid search, extracting a leather wallet from his ruined blazer. He pulled the fake corporate identification cards and relayed the name to the central dispatch radio. The response crackled over the radio seconds later. The dispatcher confirmed a priority federal alert. Travis was immediately identified as an active fugitive wanted for international wire fraud and identity theft. The local police hauled him roughly to his knees, reading him his rights, while blood dripped from his split lip onto his expensive shirt. A fourth vehicle swung into the driveway, entirely ignoring the police perimeter. Diane parked her luxury SUV aggressively on the manicured front lawn. She and Megan stepped out into the flashing lights. They looked completely exhausted and thoroughly disheveled. Dark grease stains from the industrial storage facility ruined their expensive clothes. They had clearly manipulated their way out of the trespassing charges at the commercial park, likely deploying a fabricated story to appease the facility's security guards. They arrived at the villa driven by blind entitlement, expecting to find me cowering in the study, ready to negotiate a massive financial settlement. They marched toward the front doors, completely ignoring the officers securing the exterior. Diane pushed the heavy oak doors open and stopped dead in her tracks. The security camera captured the exact moment her brain attempted to process the visual data. The grand hall was a vast, cavernous void. The antique furniture was gone. The imported rugs were gone. The massive crystal chandeliers had been stripped from the vaulted ceilings, leaving only bare wires hanging from the plaster. The entire physical manifestation of her wealth and status had been systematically vaporized in a matter of hours. Megan bumped into her back, letting out a sharp gasp of confusion. They did not comprehend the scale of the liquidation. They marched forward, their high heels clicking loudly against the bare subflooring, following the harsh sound of police radios echoing from the kitchen. Diane rounded the corner with Megan trailing closely behind her. They expected to find me cornered by the authorities, facing the consequences of the sudden eviction. Instead, they found Travis kneeling on the floor, surrounded by armed police. The arrogant, confident facade he used to manipulate Megan was completely gone. He looked like a trapped animal. Diane froze in the doorway. The lead officer raised a hand, instructing the two women to stay back from the secured suspect. Travis looked up and locked eyes with Megan. He did not ask for legal assistance. He did not offer a single word of apology. He glared at her with pure, unfiltered hostility. He blamed her entire family for exposing his operation to the federal investigators. The officer holding the wallet spoke into his radio, requesting transport for the federal fugitive. Diane listened to the dispatch codes. She realized the man she had allowed into her home, the man who was supposed to elevate their social standing to the highest tier of coastal society, was nothing more than a wanted criminal. The alliance fractured permanently in real time. They were three parasites turning on each other inside the empty shell of their former host. The lead officer finished securing the kitchen perimeter. He walked over to the massive marble island to document the point of entry. He noticed the thick manila folder resting perfectly aligned under the brass paperweight. He picked it up, examining the blank cover. He looked at Diane, assuming she was the primary homeowner based on her aggressive entrance. He walked over and handed the folder directly to her, stating it was left on the counter. Diane grabbed the envelope. Her hands shook violently as she tore open the flap. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I watched her read the top page through the high-resolution camera feed. It was the finalized absolute divorce filing. The document was meticulously drafted by my legal team, invoking every protective clause to permanently deny her any claim to my assets or future earnings. She frantically flipped to the next section. It was a high-resolution copy of the secondary mortgage application she had forged just 2 days prior. My forensic accountants had attached a formal authenticated analysis, proving her signature was a criminal fabrication. It was the exact duplicate of the evidence currently sitting on a federal investigator's desk, waiting to trigger her own arrest warrant. Diane flipped to the final section, breathing heavily. It was a definitive certified financial report detailing my domestic holdings. The balances were all absolute zeros. The joint accounts were permanently closed. The liquid assets were successfully moved into the untouchable offshore blind trust. The report mathematically and legally proved that I owed them absolutely nothing. Diane dropped the folder. The heavy pages scattered across the bare floor, landing near the bloodstains left by Travis. She looked around the empty, echoing kitchen. The realization was absolute and crushing. She had no home. She had no money. She had no leverage. She was standing in the ruins of her own creation, surrounded by law enforcement, holding the undeniable proof of her complete and utter destruction. I closed the laptop in my hotel suite. The operation was a flawless success. The morning of the intended wedding arrives under a thick canopy of heavy gray clouds. Megan wakes up on a sagging mattress inside the Highway Motor Inn. She forces her mother to help her into the ruined ivory wedding dress. The delicate silk fabric is already heavily stained from dragging across the asphalt parking lot. They drive the luxury SUV toward the city center, clinging to a massive delusion. Megan refuses to cancel the ceremony. She believes she can simply arrive at the St. Jude Cathedral and force the staff to proceed with the event. She assumes the sheer momentum of her social expectations will override the catastrophic financial collapse of the previous day. They pull into the cobblestone courtyard of the historic cathedral. The massive wrought iron gates are completely secured with thick industrial chains and heavy brass padlocks. Megan steps out of the vehicle and marches toward the entrance. She grabs the cold iron bars and shakes them violently. A property manager steps out from the adjacent rectory building. He does not unlock the gates. He holds up a digital tablet displaying their contract. He informs them in a loud, clear voice that their reservation was formally terminated 48 hours ago. He states the international wire transfer initiated by the groom bounced and immediately triggered a severe fraud alert with the Archdiocese banking institution. He explicitly tells Diane that their names have been added to a permanent blacklist. The cathedral security detail steps out from the side door. They instruct Diane to remove her vehicle from the private driveway immediately or face trespassing charges. Diane reverses the SUV into the street. The situation rapidly deteriorates as Diane's smartphone begins to vibrate incessantly in the center console. It is not a call from a concerned bridesmaid. It is an automated notification from a highly exclusive local society digital newsletter. The primary reception venue has released an aggressive public statement on their official social media channels. Diane reads the text aloud while navigating the morning traffic. The venue management explicitly apologizes to their elite clientele for the sudden schedule vacancy this weekend. They cite the immediate cancellation of the Hughes event due to unverified financial instruments and active federal fraud investigations linked to the primary sponsors. The venue publicly distances itself to protect its prestigious reputation. The digital post goes viral within their insulated social circle in a matter of minutes. Megan's phone begins to sound with a relentless stream of incoming alerts. Group chats dissolve instantly. Bridesmaids send sterile automated text messages citing sudden family emergencies or unpredictable illnesses. The social contagion of financial ruin spreads through their network with absolute efficiency. Nobody wants to be photographed at an event funded by criminal fraud. Megan refuses to accept the collapse of her narrative. Her narcissistic entitlement overrides all logical processing. She types a frantic mass message to the remaining guest list on her phone. She declares a sudden change of venue due to a cathedral scheduling error. She unilaterally relocates the ceremony to the Botanical Gardens at Centennial Park. She forces Diane to accelerate toward the public recreation area. The ground at Centennial Park is heavily saturated from a previous rainstorm. Megan steps out of the vehicle and drags the heavy silk train of her gown directly through thick brown mud. She marches toward the central wooden gazebo, attempting to claim the public space for her private event. A small handful of guests arrive. They do not wear joyful expressions or carry wrapped gifts. They wear looks of intense, morbid curiosity. They stand at the edge of the wet grass, whispering among themselves and continuously checking their phones. They are present solely to witness the spectacle of a high society collapse. Two heavy box trucks pull onto the gravel service road next to the gazebo. These are the secondary vendors Megan attempted to secure using Diane heavily compromised emergency credit limits. The rental coordinator steps out of the primary cab. He does not instruct his crew to begin unloading the white wooden folding chairs or the floral arches. He walks directly up to Megan. He holds a digital payment terminal and a printed invoice. He informs her that the transaction processed yesterday afternoon was forcibly reversed by the issuing bank this morning due to a federal hold on the account. He demands $4,000 in hard physical cash before his crew touches a single piece of equipment. Diane steps forward, attempting to deploy her usual aggressive posturing. She threatens to ruin the vendor reputation and promises a massive civil lawsuit. The vendor does not flinch. He pulls up the venue public post on his own smartphone and displays it directly in front of Diane's face. He states that he knows exactly who they are and that their credit is entirely worthless in this city. He points to the thick mud ruining the bottom of Megan's dress. He repeats his demand for physical cash. Diane opens her designer purse. She has exactly $40 in loose currency. Her gold cards are useless plastic rectangles. The vendor shakes his head in disgust. He signals his crew. They climb back into the trucks. The heavy diesel engines roar to life. The trucks reverse down the gravel road, taking the chairs, the flowers, and the last shred of logistical support with them. Megan spins around, frantically searching the perimeter of the public park. She pulls out her phone and dials Travis' number for the 50th time that morning. The call routes immediately to a disconnected, automated message. Travis is currently sitting on a cold stainless steel bench inside a federal holding cell, undergoing aggressive interrogation by specialized forensic accountants. He is wearing a bright orange institutional jumpsuit instead of a custom-tailored tuxedo. He has already surrendered every piece of information regarding Diane mortgage forgery in a desperate bid to secure a leniency agreement. He is never coming to the park. He is never walking down an aisle. The illusion of the wealthy logistics executive is completely dead and buried under federal indictments. The small group of remaining guests watch the vendor trucks drive away into the distance. They look at the bride standing ankle-deep in cold mud. The reality of the situation is absolute and undeniable. There is no groom. There is no caterer. There is no private string quartet. There is absolutely no wealthy stepfather arriving to rescue the event and pay the outstanding balances. The guests do not offer any apologies or words of sympathy. They do not approach Megan to offer comfort. They slowly back away, stepping carefully to avoid ruining their own expensive shoes in the mud. They return to their luxury vehicles in suffocating, absolute silence. Engine blocks turn over one by one. The cars pull away from the curb, merging into the city traffic. Within 10 minutes, the park is entirely empty. Megan is left standing completely alone in the center of the wooden gazebo. The cold wind blows across the open grass. The fraudulent empire she attempted to build through manipulation and entitlement is reduced to a ruined dress and an empty public park. The extraction is finalized. The polished mahogany doors of the family court swing shut, sealing the room in a heavy judicial silence. The divorce proceedings commence with an aggressive velocity that completely ignores standard preliminary mediation. Diane sits at the defense table wearing a severely tailored charcoal suit designed to project an image of dignified suffering. Her legal counsel is a notoriously ruthless litigator known for extracting massive settlements from wealthy executives. He was hired on a contingency basis, fueled by Diane promising him a significant percentage of my corporate assets. He stands before the presiding judge and immediately launches into a highly theatrical opening statement. He paints Diane as a devoted, loyal partner who has been callously discarded by a vindictive tyrant. He formally submits a staggering demand for permanent alimony. He requests exclusive ownership of multiple coastal properties that have already been liquidated. He demands a massive punitive payout for alleged emotional distress, claiming the sudden eviction caused irreversible psychological trauma to his client. He speaks for 20 uninterrupted minutes, constructing a completely fabricated narrative of domestic victimization. I sit quietly at the plaintiff table, perfectly still. Warren sits beside me, organizing his files with mechanical precision. He does not raise a single objection during the opposing counsel performance. He allows the lawyer to completely exhaust his aggressive rhetoric and lock Diane into her fraudulent narrative on the official court record. When the judge finally turns to our table, Warren stands up slowly. He bypasses the standard opening remarks entirely. He does not argue against the emotional distress claims. He does not debate the value of the alimony demands. He signals his paralegal, who wheels a heavy metal cart filled with thick indexed binders directly toward the bench. Warren approaches the judge and hands him the primary evidence dossier. He speaks in a flat, clinical tone that immediately drains the warmth from the room. He announces that before the court can consider any distribution of marital assets, it must first address a critical matter of financial perjury and felony fraud. Warren opens the first binder and directs the judge to page 4. He formally submits the high-resolution copies of the secondary mortgage application into evidence. He meticulously details how Diane illicitly obtained my private corporate identification numbers. He presents the comprehensive forensic analysis provided by a certified handwriting expert, explicitly proving that my signature on the loan documents is a complete fabrication. He hands over the notarized security logs, proving Diane facilitated the presence of a compromised notary public on the estate grounds while I was traveling overseas. The judge adjusts his glasses and reads the forensic report. The ambient atmosphere in the courtroom shifts instantly. The initial judicial neutrality evaporates entirely. The judge lowers the documents and directs a sharp, highly critical glare directly at Diane. Her attorney attempts to intervene loudly, claiming these documents are irrelevant to the current family court proceedings. He argues that financial disputes should be handled in a separate civil arena. The judge strikes his gavel with a loud crack and orders the lawyer to remain completely silent. Warren does not stop. He pulls a second heavy binder from the cart. He submits the certified banking ledgers extracted directly from the industrial storage facility. He explicitly details the comprehensive history of the biological child support payments. He traces the exact flow of funds from Megan's biological father through the mandated state channels and directly into hidden offshore accounts, entirely controlled by Diane. Warren explains how Diane systematically concealed this massive stream of income during her initial marital asset disclosures 20 years ago. He provides the court with the withdrawal slips proving she utilized those specific custodial funds to finance her extravagant personal shopping habits and luxury spa treatments. He formally states that this constitutes absolute perjury against the family court and represents a massive financial fraud committed directly against her own daughter. The opposing attorney physically steps away from Diane at the defense table. He looks at the undeniable documentary evidence presented before the court. He realizes instantly that he has been fed a completely fabricated narrative by a highly toxic client. He understands that continuing to aggressively advocate for Diane under these specific circumstances will severely jeopardize his own professional license and expose his firm to massive retaliatory litigation. The aggressive posturing vanishes. He hastily withdraws his demands for alimony and attempts to salvage a basic standardized settlement just to close the disastrous session. Warren immediately rejects the compromise. He invokes the ironclad prenuptial agreement drafted decades ago. He highlights the specific morality clauses and financial disclosure requirements that Diane has unequivocally violated through her documented actions. The judge leans forward over the heavy wooden bench. He delivers a blistering verbal reprimand that echoes loudly through the quiet courtroom. He states that the actions perpetrated by Diane demonstrate a profound and calculated disregard for the law and the fundamental principles of the judicial system. He officially nullifies any remaining marital claims she might have attempted to leverage against my estate. He validates the prenuptial agreement in its absolute entirety. He explicitly denies every single request for alimony property division and emotional damages. He declares that Diane is granted absolutely nothing from my financial holdings. The The judicial execution continues without a moment of pause. The judge calculates the immense legal fees incurred by my corporate team while defending against the fraudulent mortgage application. He rules that Diane is entirely responsible for this financial burden. He orders her to pay full monetary restitution directly to Warren Legal Firm within 30 days. He then turns to the court stenographer and issues a devastating mandate. He explicitly instructs that the entire docket regarding the forged real estate documents and the concealed child support ledgers be forwarded directly to the district attorney office. He looks Diane in the eyes and informs her that she is now facing imminent criminal charges for felony forgery and perjury. Diane sits at the defense table, completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of her downfall. The arrogant posture she maintained throughout our marriage is permanently shattered. Her designer suit suddenly looks absurd against the reality of her situation. She is entirely bankrupt. She owes massive legal fees she has absolutely no ability to pay. She is actively facing a lengthy prison sentence in a state facility. Her attorney rapidly packs his briefcase, completely ignoring her panicked whispers. He walks out of the courtroom, eager to distance himself from a criminal liability. Megan sits alone in the back row of the public gallery. She wears a plain, wrinkled dress that serves as a sharp contrast to her former curated wardrobe. She watches her mother get systematically dismantled by the judicial system in total silence. Megan processes her own inescapable and terrifying reality. She has no coastal inheritance waiting for her. She has no stolen child support funds to access for basic survival. Furthermore, she is now legally bound to Travis. The hasty private ceremony they conducted before the wedding disaster legally tied their financial futures together. Travis is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting trial for massive corporate wire fraud and identity theft. Any debt Travis accrued during his desperate attempts to flee the state is now legally attached to her name. She is effectively destitute and permanently shackled to a federally indicted felon. I stand up from the plaintiff table and calmly button my tailored suit jacket. I do not look over at Diane trembling at the defense table. I do not glance back at Megan crying silently in the gallery. I do not offer any final words or gloat over the absolute destruction of their lives. The execution was surgical, precise, and thoroughly justified. I walk out through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom into the bright, clear afternoon light, leaving the two women behind to navigate the suffocating permanent ruins of their own greed. The sliding glass doors of the International Departure Terminal parted smoothly. The sterile ambient air of the concourse washed over my face. I walked past the chaotic lines of frantic travelers dragging heavy luggage. My own load consisted entirely of a single black leather overnight bag. My footsteps echoed lightly against the polished terrazzo floors. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of domestic performance was completely gone. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints and navigated directly toward the private expedited screening corridor, reserved for premium ticket holders. The transportation security agent processed my credentials with silent efficiency. I stepped onto the moving walkway and allowed the mechanical belt to carry me toward the international gates. The frantic energy of the city I was leaving behind felt entirely disconnected from my current physical reality. I was a ghost moving through a transitional space. The gate attendant scanned my digital boarding pass and gestured toward the enclosed jet bridge. I stepped aboard the wide-body aircraft and turned left toward the exclusive first-class cabin. The environment was a masterclass in engineered tranquility. Thick sound-dampening curtains completely isolated the section from the rest of the plane. I located my assigned private suite near the window. The seating area featured polished wood paneling and soft ambient lighting. I stowed my leather bag in the overhead compartment and settled into the deep ergonomic seat. The flight was a direct route to Geneva, with a scheduled secondary transport waiting to take me deep into the Swiss Alps. The destination was deliberate. It offered a climate and a culture entirely devoid of coastal superficiality. I retrieved my encrypted laptop from my briefcase and placed it on the wide tray table. I booted the machine and bypassed the dual authentication protocols using a randomized biometric scan. The secure banking portal loaded onto the screen. I opened the primary ledger for the offshore blind trust. The financial architecture was flawless. Exactly $4 million sat securely distributed across a highly insulated network of international municipal bonds and stable foreign equities. The capital was completely shielded from any domestic legal jurisdiction. The balance had not fluctuated by a single cent during the entire extraction operation. The meticulously planned financial demolition had consumed only the assets Diane believed she controlled. My actual life savings remained a pristine, untouched fortress of liquid security. I reviewed the dividend projections for the upcoming fiscal quarter. The numbers guaranteed permanent absolute independence. A dull vibration interrupted the quiet hum of the aircraft cabin. I looked down at the small black burner phone resting next to my laptop. The screen illuminated with a local area code. The incoming call belonged to a public payphone located near the downtown municipal courthouse. Diane was attempting to bypass the block I had placed on her primary mobile device. I did not answer. I watched the digital timer count the seconds as the call routed directly to the automated voicemail system. The screen darkened momentarily before an audio notification icon appeared. I retrieved a single wireless earpiece and placed it in my right ear. I tapped the screen to initiate the audio playback. I needed to verify the exact status of her psychological collapse. The recording began with the chaotic background noise of passing city traffic and wailing sirens. Diane spoke into the receiver. Her voice was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, polished tone she had utilized to command caterers and manipulate social circles was entirely obliterated. She sounded feral and severely dehydrated. She begged me to pick up the line. She pleaded for a secondary negotiation. The panic in her breathing indicated that the criminal forgery charges were already being processed by the district attorney. She realized the staggering scale of her legal jeopardy. She claimed she had been temporarily blinded by the pressure of maintaining their social status. She desperately attempted to rewrite the narrative of her massive fraud as a simple misunderstanding. Then she offered the ultimate transaction. She explicitly promised to entirely disown Megan. She stated she would sever all ties with her daughter and testify against Travis if I would simply wire enough capital to cover her immediate criminal defense retainers. She was willing to sacrifice her own child to avoid a prison sentence. The moral bankruptcy was absolute and thoroughly documented in that single desperate offer. I listened to the raw, pathetic sound of her weeping for exactly 3 seconds. I tapped the red icon on the glass screen. The audio playback terminated, instantly cutting off her frantic apologies mid-sentence. I accessed the internal phone settings and permanently purged the voicemail from the local storage drive and the cloud backup. I pressed the physical power button and shut the mobile device down completely. I removed the protective rear casing and extracted the microscopic plastic cellular card with my fingernail. I pinched the small square of plastic between my thumb and forefinger and applied sharp pressure. The microchip snapped cleanly in half, rendering the digital connection permanently dead. I dropped the broken pieces of plastic into the empty porcelain coffee cup resting on my console. The flight attendant approached my suite with silent steps. She carried a silver tray holding a heavy crystal tumbler. She gently placed the glass on the polished wood surface. It contained a generous measure of top-shelf single malt scotch poured neat. I nodded my thanks and she retreated behind the privacy curtain. I picked up the heavy crystal glass and took a slow, measured breath. The complex aroma of the aged liquor filled the small space. The massive jet engines beneath the wings roared to life, sending a deep, powerful vibration through the floorboards. The aircraft pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the primary runway. I closed my laptop and slid it back into the leather briefcase. I locked the brass clasps and placed the bag securely beneath the seat in front of me. The physical actions grounded me in the present moment. I leaned back against the leather headrest and looked out the reinforced acrylic window. The plane accelerated violently down the tarmac, pressing me deep into the seat. The nose lifted sharply, tearing us away from the earth. I looked down as we breached the heavy gray cloud cover. The sprawling city below rapidly shrunk into an insignificant grid of meaningless lights. The coastal villa, the storage facility, the courthouse, and the public park all vanished beneath a thick blanket of white vapor. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. The rich, smoky flavor burned pleasantly in the back of my throat. The extraction was absolute. The reset was permanent. I closed my eyes and enjoyed the perfect silence of the sky. True security does not exist in the accumulation of material possessions or the endless pursuit of superficial social validation. Wealth is merely a powerful tool that amplifies the underlying character of the individual wielding it. When fundamental trust is broken by pure greed and blind entitlement, mere communication is rarely sufficient to correct the downward trajectory. True peace is often achieved through decisive, silent action and the strict enforcement of absolute boundaries. Protecting your own dignity sometimes requires walking away entirely and allowing those who betrayed you to face the unmitigated consequences of their own destructive choices. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below.